All right, mate. Has your proximity to Lex ruined how you relate to Australians?
No, not at all. Not at all. I have a few good Australian friends and actually Australian family as well. So definitely not.
Did you end up spending much time in Bundaberg or Sydney in research for this book?
In Bundaberg, no, I didn't. No, I didn't at all. I am told that the book is very well read there. I believe it's sold out there. And I'm also told it's kind of divided the community. There's some people who've done very well out of Greensill farming, which has received an awful lot of money from Greensill Capital. And so those people, I think, are very supportive of Lex and his family. And then there are a whole bunch of other people who feel like they didn't do so well out of it, who were farmers whose farms were squeezed by Greensill farming, and they feel pretty upset about what happened.
It's just such a stark contrast and subversion of your expectations of what a bogan from rural Queensland would aspire to. The idea that, he wanted to be knighted in the UK and wanted to be in the top class drinking the fanciest champagne, it's so opposite to what I would expect from a fella from Bundaberg.
Um, yeah, I think that's right. I think Lex, so my understanding of Lex as a kid was that he was sort of, you know, bullied a little bit. He was not a very big kid. It was a very kind of rough and tumble place to grow up. And he was, on the other hand, quite intellectual. And that was how he saw his way out, right? So he kind of, his brains were his way out. And then I think he realized, or he believed, that actually to make a lot of money, he had to sort of portray himself as a guy who came from, the right side of the tracks, as it were, or, could mix with the wealthy upper class kind of finance people and politicians in the UK. And so it's definitely odd, right? It definitely means he stood out. But he was kind of standing out from quite an early age. I know now, since I wrote the book, I probably know more people in Bundaberg than I did before I wrote the book. And I know now that at school he was already, as a fairly young kid, he was kind of dressing in a way that other people found was odd. So that he was, an example is he was a leading light in the debating club at school, and where the other guys would show up to the debating club in Bundaberg in shorts and t-shirts because it's like subtropical or whatever it is. Lex would show up like in a stiff shirt and long trousers, and this is kind of when he's like 12, 13, and was already regarded as a little bit odd for that.
Interesting. Do you know where in talking to people from Bundaberg and being the recipient of anecdotes such as that, have you come to a understanding for where Lex just got his intense ambition from?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm like about to engage in, a field of research that I'm not qualified to engage in. But like the pop psychology of it would be this kind of bullying, right? Like this is his way to get back. Like he can't get one over on the big kids when he's growing up by like out fighting them or outrunning them. He gets one over on them by being kind of smarter than them, and by helping his parents have the biggest farm in the area.
Mm.
And so I think that is sort of, yeah, it seems like a logical place to start when you look at why is Lex ambitious. Um, I think he clearly, like him and his brothers, all three of them, I think, get kind of pushed around a little bit. And so I think there is a sense of like sticking it to these people who pushed him about when he was a kid. When one of the other anecdotes I heard was, one of the other anecdotes I heard was that when he was, running Greensill Capital and making a lot of money, he would, if people from Bundaberg who'd grown up with were in the UK, for instance, and he heard about it, he would offer up to them, hey, why don't you go and fly on my private jet? I'll fly you to Spain or Italy on my private jet. And it's this kind of like showing off to them, that look, you might have thought I was just some little, smaller kid than you when we were all growing up, but look at me now.
We're all just trying to get back at our high school bullies at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Well, it feels like if half the town's on his side and, the book is flying off the shelves there, in some sense, he sort of has fulfilled that getting back at the people who didn't think he would ever become much from his childhood. He's a well-known guy in Bundaberg now. People knew that he rubbed shoulders with David Cameron. It doesn't really matter how it all ended up.
Yeah.
Like, this is a guy from Bundaberg who has done something on the international stage.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's an element of truth to that, but I think the story's not finished yet, right? So I think, there's two things I would say to that. One is what I'm told, as it collapses, when there are like these rare moments of introspection, because I think Lex, firmly believes he never did anything wrong. In these rare moments of like him kind of thinking maybe I did, what he would say to people, I brought shame on the family name, or words to that effect.
Yeah.
So I think he was aware that actually how it ended up was not good for his family. And I guess that is the danger, right? When you call it Greensill Farming Group or Greensill Capital or Greensill Bank, your name is all over it. So when it goes wrong, it's your name. So there's that. And then I think the other thing I would say is it isn't over yet, right? And so at the minute, he's still a wealthy guy. The farm has all this money. It's, one of the biggest agribusinesses in the region, if not in Australia, I think now. And, but it is not over. And there are criminal investigations in Switzerland and Germany. There are some pretty big lawsuits in Australia. There's an SFO investigation that's kind of linked to Greensill here in the UK. He's been named personally in the criminal investigation in Switzerland, for instance. So, that isn't like it's one thing to be the big personality in Bundaberg, but not if you're the big personality in Bundaberg because of things that went really badly wrong.
Is there a genuine threat that he serves jail time?
Well, again, that would be me getting into another area that I'm not qualified to get into, as well as psychology, into kind of deeply into the law. But I think in Switzerland, look, I think the case in Switzerland seems to be the most, furthest along. It's progressed the most, and the Swiss authorities seem like they are serious about trying to pursue a criminal investigation. They've named a bunch of guys who worked at Credit Suisse, which was the bank that was deeply involved with the Greensill funds, and Lex is also party to their investigation, and so that is I don't know how that ends up, but it seems very serious, and certainly I wouldn't want to be the subject of a criminal investigation.
No, certainly not. Okay, so that's a little bit about where he is at the moment, but that does beg the question, how did he get there?
Yeah.
At the foundation of this entire book, which documents the Greensill fraud and scandal and, in some language, Ponzi scheme, is something we've already touched upon. His intense sort of charisma, ambition, ability to be a salesperson. So, in one sense, to start the story, I think the anecdote from when he was working at that Sydney firm is a good way just to highlight what type of character we're talking about here.
Yeah, so you're talking about way back, like this is 20 odd years ago when he's
Yeah.
first starting out. He is a guy with essentially like no experience in business or finance, right? He's a guy with a law degree and some experience of working for like a local farming lobby group. Nevertheless, he has a resume of about 20 pages, which is pretty extensive for anyone, and lots of pretty extravagant claims of being kind of world. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's like world champion debater and things
Yeah,
like that,
yeah.
which kind of laughable. But he walks into this firm, which is um, kind of it's like the remnants of a property development company that is kind of flipped into like a hothouse for tech startups. And he walks in and says, "Look, I want to be paid. I think you should hire me." He says, the guy who's running it, "I think you should hire me, and I think you should pay me, basically the salary that you're paying the top guys who've been here 20 years." And the guy sort of laughs at him. It's like, that's a ridiculous claim. Nevertheless, I really like your ambition. So why don't you come and work here? And that sort of thing actually works for him for the next 20 years, right? He continues to make ever more kind of elaborate or extravagant claims, ever more kind of like, hey, next we're all going to be billionaires. Within a few years of that, he's in Morgan Stanley and he's saying, we're all going to be billionaires. If you guys back me, we're all going to be billionaires. And everybody kind of thinks similar to what happened in Sydney. People kind of go, well, that's ridiculous. But, maybe we'll be multimillionaires. So let's just, like, this guy's crazy, but let's just go along for the ride. And that sort of serves him pretty well. And, good luck to him, right? Like, there's nothing really wrong with that.
Right.
With a lot of ambition and, setting the bar really high, trying to, whatever metaphor you want to use, shoot for the moon. And, if people buy into it, well done, right? That's all fine, I think. It's when it becomes sort of unconstrained and it sort of strays into areas where he's kind of not telling the truth, or he's, which happens a lot, or he's, deliberately misleading people so that they'll provide financing to him, then you get into a whole other area. But yeah, I think, there are very early signs that this is a guy who is incredibly ambitious. He will say and do whatever it takes. And some people go along with that because, that's kind of the way the world works.
Is there some alternative universe where he just managed to continue to fake it until he ultimately made it?
That's a really interesting question. I've thought about it a lot. In some ways there is, because there is a sort of, we can get into it, but there's a legitimate business inside Greensill Capital. There's an illegitimate one too, but there is a legitimate business. So there is a universe in which that legitimate business carries on. The problem with the idea that there is an alternative, universe in which it's all okay is that universe probably does not contain Lex Greensill, because he is who he is. And, my view is he's shown no signs at any stage throughout, his entire career, and even since it's collapsed, that this is a guy who, wants to do things on the level, that he knows where to draw the line, that he's a guy who you can trust, frankly.
If he did, in this alternative universe, carry on and eventually make it, would the ends have justified the means?
Well, it's a good question. Look, I think that's a question that is part of, like, it's a big question for our time, right? Because it is, he is very similar in many ways to Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos, and, the guy at WeWork and so on, where it is that kind of, use the phrase, fake it till you make it. Well, difficult to say, right? Like, I think he knew that there were things wrong with his business. And his view was, if we grow it big enough, I can kind of deal with those things. But, isn't that kind of true of all people who, many people who kind of go rogue in finance? Is that any different to the rogue traders who are like, oh, I'm in the hole. If I just keep betting more and more money, I'll get myself out of the hole. I mean, I think that's kind of what happens to everybody in these situations.
There's a great anecdote from Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but it's not actually one anecdote. It's multiple anecdotes of Steve, one, selling features that don't exist, demoing features that didn't exist, and being a total fabrication. Ultimately then delivering in the final hour, and Apple is what it is now, an incredible company. And Steve Jobs is remembered as an absolutely incredible founder, although if you read that same biography, you should also come to the conclusion that he was a phenomenal asshole. But I don't know. It's just like it's different fields. But no, sorry, you go on.
Totally understand where you're coming from. I think it is different, and I think I don't want to undersell the level of wrongdoing. So I'm very careful not to use the word fraud because Lex has not been uh, convicted or
Alleged.
even charged with fraud yet. Um, he has been accused in Parliament in the UK of running a Ponzi scheme and by others. So, I think we're free to talk about that. What I would say though is there are like things coming out now, and things I wrote about in the book that show that this is clearly somebody doing something that this is more than like saying, oh, my the iPhone will be able to, have Google Maps on it when it doesn't yet have it. This
Mm.
is there, for instance, there is a particular loan. So, what's wrong with Lex is he's lending other people's money, right? He's going to um, Credit Suisse or previous to that, a big asset manager called GAM, and he's persuading them to give their clients money to him, and he is lending it out to borrowers, companies that are essentially he's sourcing, right? And he's saying, oh, these guys are good for these loans. So he's lending out other people's money. So then where it goes wrong is when you start to look at some of the loans and some of the loan deals, and these are loans that are clearly never going to get paid back. These are often loans to friends and family of Lex, or people close to Lex.
Mm.
There's one that is mentioned in a court case, has been mentioned in a court case recently in Australia, which I wrote a little bit about, but there's more detail out on it now, where they take some money from this asset manager, GAM. They take it's 20 odd $1 million, and Greensill lends it to this company, small industrial conglomerate in the UK, which may or may not be a like legitimate business itself. But they lend this money, 20 odd $1 million. The legal documents that have come out recently show that of the 20 odd million, 5 million went to Lex as an arrangement fee. 5 million went to one of the directors. I think another 5 or more million went to another one of the directors. So as arrangement fees. So the loan, what was left in the company, was only a few $1 million. Like, how are they ever going to pay that back? Like,
Mm.
they didn't
Mm.
get the money. It went straight out the door. There were loans to Lex's neighbor. Actually, it's more than Lex's neighbor. It's a guy who lives in a property on Lex's land. This is not quite right, right? There are loans that he makes to guys he's known for a few years, and they just get rolled over and over and over again. So when they come due, rather than the loan be paid back, Lex just sort of automatically makes a new loan, so they of the same amount or more even, and so those loans never ever get paid back. So he's sort of suggesting, to the investors, the people whose money he's taken, that hey, these are great loans. I'm giving you money, and it's coming back, but actually, it never does come back. In fact, there's no expectation it'll come back. So that's a bit different, I think, than claiming that your Mac can do things that are still in the research and development stage.
Because the victim ultimately is being taken for a far bigger ride, or the consequences are far more severe.
Well, because I think you're outright lying. It's not like, hey, this loan, like if you're saying, hey, there's this thing on an iPhone or a Mac that's in research development and we'll get it later. That this is like these are supposed to be super safe loans
Mm.
that pay a certain return, whereas in fact they're highly risky loans that are not being paid back ever. They're
Yeah.
not really
Yeah.
loans at all, right? If it's a loan that never gets paid back, what is that? That's not a loan. That's just a payment to
Yeah.
a friend of yours, and you taking it as well. And so that whole structure only works so long as you can keep persuading people to put more and more money into it. Um, you know, that's what a Ponzi scheme is, right? It works. It's an investment that works so long as more money keeps coming in. But as soon as the money stops coming in and investors want their money back, you kind of look and go, well, actually, there isn't any money back because I took it all. I spent it.
Okay, so we've touched upon so far parts of the Greensill empire, which is multiple businesses that are legitimate businesses, and then the example you just gave, which is just completely illegitimate business. So to really get the play-by-play from Lex, the overly ambitious banker, through Lex, the unicorn founder, through to Lex, the disgraced financier fraudster, one should listen to or read the book for sure to get the true play-by-play. For the sake of the podcast, I thought it'd be best to just ask you if you could separate it into two sort of columns. The Greensill affair, how much was Ponzi scheme lies, and then how much was perfectly legal within the bounds of creative accounting?
Yeah. So, there are very different views on this, right? So we have to take a bit of a step back and say, what is it that he's trying to sell? What kind of finance is Lex Greensill into? And it's something called supply chain finance. It is essentially you provide loans to companies to pay their suppliers, right? So it's sort of short-term loans. It's like a factory that buys widgets from its supplier, and you provide a loan to make that transaction happen more efficiently. So it should be really short-term, and that's why it should be safe. And you provide loads and loads and loads of these loans, and so again, so it becomes sort of safer. If any one loan collapses, it's not a big deal. So in theory, that stuff is all legit, and it's something that's happened for decades, if not hundreds of years in different formats. And Lex is in that business. Now, that immediately raises a question, right? Like, how can Lex be in this business if it's been around forever? How can you get into this out of nowhere? And, that's a very legitimate question, and there's not a great answer for it. But what he does is he kind of essentially undercuts the banks on this business. So he goes to asset managers, GAM, Credit Suisse, and he says, look, I can do this business. If you give me some money, I'm not a bank, so if you give me some of your clients' money, I will finance these loans, and your clients will get back, a decent return. And that's kind of, in essence, what's happening. So how much of this is legitimate and how much of it isn't? Well, he deals with a lot of legitimate names. So, Coca-Cola, I think Ford Motor Company, Nestle, like a lot of really big companies. He doesn't make any money off those deals, right? Nothing at all. The documents I've seen, Greensill documents I've seen, all of the business he was doing, billions of dollars of transactions with big names, big sort of blue chip companies, he is making no money or a loss on those deals. All of his profits are coming from a handful of other clients who are not big companies. They're companies like the one I mentioned earlier. It's like this little industrial conglomerate in the UK, or his neighbor. In some cases, there are other supply chain finance businesses that are similar kind of startups to his own. And then there are a couple of bigger ones. So one is Sanjeev Gupta, the steel magnate's metals business, and the other is a company called Bluestone Resources, which is a coal mining company in West Virginia, owned by the governor of West Virginia in the US. And between those sort of groups, that makes all of Greensill's profit. However, those loans are not supply chain finance loans at all. They're just kind of, he takes the client money from Gamma or Credit Suisse and hands it over with no expectation he'll ever get paid back, and he takes a cut. And so he's able to kind of show profits because his profits all come from this kind of high risk lending. And he's able to show kind of volume because the volume comes from the low risk lending to blue chip companies, which is entirely unprofitable. So how much of his business is legit and how much isn't? In the past, I've said, well, based on the volume of transactions, maybe 75% is legit and 25% isn't. But that might be a false way to look at it. I think as I've learned more and more about Greensill, I think probably a more accurate way to look at it is to say, well, let's look at how much profit was coming from legitimate businesses and how much was coming from, the less legitimate stuff. And if you look at that, well, it's essentially like there's nothing coming from the legitimate business that is not profitable. It's loss making, and so the whole business is essentially, stuff that should not exist. It is high risk. It is not what he's telling his clients they're getting.
Is it a mastermind of accounting or a master of salesmanship that could make that exact scenario you just described possible?
It's a little bit of both, right? So there's an accounting kind of trick in there, and I'm a former chartered accountant. Before I was a journalist, I was an accountant for about 10 years. So, I admire the accounting trickery. But
Giving you
so
some
there's a
ideas.
little bit of, yeah. It's so there's definitely a little bit of that going on. So, you know, probably more relevant than the accounting per se is that there's a lot of like complexity around the structure of the investment vehicles. So there's layer upon layer of corporate entities. Some of them are Greensill entities. Some of them are have other names. He has a bank in Germany. Like all the money just gets funneled around in many, many different ways, and so that complexity is kind of important. I think sales is super important. He is a great salesman, and in fact, if he'd stayed as a salesman, maybe there is an alternative universe there where he's just a really good salesman.
Yeah.
But a salesman in charge of a bank is probably not a good thing. And so I think he grows this business partly by convincing people that he really has something magical when, of course, he doesn't. Um, but I think the accounting stuff is it's a little complicated, but it's actually it's not hard to find the problems in these loans. It wasn't a tricky thing to do as a journalist. Anyone could have done it really. And many, I'm not the only journalist who found this stuff, by the way. Like quite a lot of us were digging around and Googling and finding plenty of evidence that there was something wrong here.
I'm just thinking, for my own business, it would be incredible if we could get Nestle, Coca-Cola, one of these massive companies on board, and we would happily break even on it, maybe even take a small loss because it gives you so much authority to then go out and speak to other people. So there must be Lex, this upstart. No one knows who he is. He's just raised money from GAM and Credit Suisse, and he approaches these guys. There still must be, I'm imagining, an incredible amount of work and ambition and salesmanship that goes into creating these deals that then make all the other deals possible in the first place.
Yeah, I think so. So I think he's well, he has a lot of these relationships, right, with the big companies from his time in the banking world, right? So he worked for Morgan Stanley and he worked for Citigroup, and a lot of these relationships start there. There's another element, by the way, and it comes out when before Greensill Capital, when he works at Citigroup, and this is kind of the way Lex works. So there's an anecdote in the book about one of the things that gets him in trouble at Citi is he says that he's got this big deal with Philips, the Dutch electronics company. And it turns out that actually he has a deal with like a Hungarian or Eastern European subsidiary of Philips, not Philips itself. And this is kind of
That's
classic
hilarious.
how Lex's brain works. So he's not lied, right? Like he didn't lie. He didn't, but he certainly other people in the room misunderstood
Right.
what
Happy
he
to
had said
misdirect
to
you.
them. Yeah, like I think he is well aware that he often will say things that leave the person in the room with one impression when the reality is somewhat different. And that's kind of his style, which maybe that's a good sales technique in some cases. But yeah, I think you're right. Like getting all those big companies on board is legitimate, right? Like it is a legitimate way to build a business, is to go and talk to big credible businesses and use them as a kind of loss leader to build your own brand. That's fine, but if the other business that you're building is then one where you're pretending it's sort of nice, safe loans to stable companies, when in reality, it's high risk loans to companies that can't pay them back. Well, that's not great, right? Um, Using credible names to mask a business that isn't legitimate, that's a problem.
Definitely a problem. Before the collapse, so in this stage where the business is actually all going very well and he's got all the right attention from all the right people and he's raising all these incredible amounts of money around the world, there are so many Adam Nueman synchronicities with him in the way that he likes to flaunt wealth, collect celebrity. Even Masayoshi Son and the SoftBank Vision Fund are involved here. So I wanted to ask you specifically, this is before the crash, when the business is doing well, some of the details of extravagance of wealth and Lex's utter desperation to be viewed as just someone important by people who he thought was important.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, and the Adam Newman, the sort of comparison with Adam Newman's really interesting. I don't know Adam Newman, but I know what I've read, and it seems like Adam Newman kind of enjoyed that celebrity lifestyle, right? Like that was part of what was driving him, was he actually enjoyed, spending lavishly and having a non-stop party lifestyle. With Lex, it's somewhat different, I think. Because actually, in his sort of quieter moments, in some ways, he's kind of conservative, right? Like he doesn't have he has like a nice car, but it's not something people kind of remark on the fact that his car is, it's okay, but it's nothing special. You're not driving around in a Ferrari. It's a pretty sort of quiet home life in some respects. But but what he does have is like a fleet of private jets, expensive suits. He goes to dinner at great restaurants. Will buy the most expensive bottle of wine. But with Lex, that is not. I don't think that's about him. That is not the objective. Like the lavish lifestyle is not the objective. It is the means. It's like by presenting himself as a wealthy, successful businessman, Lex sort of believes he will sort of, to use the phraseology of the day, he'll kind of manifest that. He will become a rich, successful businessman by persuading people that he already is one. And I think he's sort of right to some degree, right? Like that sort of those outward displays of wealth attract people like David Cameron and plenty of others who add more credibility to who Lex Greensill is, and that brings in more money. And it's a really interesting piece of human psychology, and I think that may be his genius, right? Like that may be and it's again, I think it's like a real sales kind of sales profession technique to sort of say, well, if everybody thinks I'm really rich, they'll want to come and spend time with me, and then some of that money will rub off on me, and so on. But yeah, it's interesting. It's not, the example that's really kind of top of my mind always is, the famous Adam Newman story is the WeWork private jet, and they're kind of all partying and taking drugs on the plane and stuff. And on Lex's private jet, it is cups of tea and it's work. Everybody is like, the laptops are out, the craziest it gets is somebody might take their suit jacket off and roll up their sleeves. But it's all work. And I think he is kind of a workaholic, right? I think he is, he makes the case quite often that when people criticize him for having the private jet, so some of the investors, the SoftBanks and others, say to him, look, this is a bit extravagant. You got a whole fleet of private jets. Goldman Sachs doesn't have a fleet of private jets. This doesn't look good. He'll say, well, yeah, but, it's where I do my work. I'm on the plane all the time and I work on the plane. So, it's it's a place for me. It's not just being flash. It's just because I'm flying so often.
Remote
and,
office.
I don't want to stop working. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, whilst reading the book, there was a part of me that found the story extra intriguing because I know so intimately North Queensland, and my family's all from there. And it's like, this guy is rubbing shoulders with David Cameron and creating all this amazing business. And then so there's a part of me that thinks he's so competent in so many ways, but seemingly just ethically has zero compass at all. And to a degree, as long as it serves his final purpose, he's willing to cross that line, which makes it, like so tragic. To a degree, I don't know how much I'm just projecting my own, thoughts onto it there.
I kind of agree with you, actually. There was, when I first started talking to people about Lex as a journalist, there were definitely a couple of people I talked to who would say, there were so many skeptical people about Lex Greensill, but there were a couple of them who would say to me, look, I don't want to bash the guy. Like he's they liked the fact that he was kind of an outsider, right? There were definitely some people in finance circles who would say to me, come on, we shouldn't be giving this guy a hard time. He's like we should be rooting for him. He's an outsider. We should be supporting guys like this. And that, like, I get that, right? Like, there's an element of that I kind of I believe in too, but not when he's doing things that are wrong.
No, of course. You brought up David Cameron a little bit earlier in the Guardian review of your book. That had such a good line. But this, for the context for the audience, is just after David Cameron's ushered in Brexit. And then, like, next time he's in the news is he's roped up in this massive scandal where a bunch of the British taxpayer money has been lost. But the review said, yes, they perfectly surmised the relationship between Lex and Dave Cameron by saying, Lex got the class, David got the money.
Yeah, so... Well, Lex had kind of got into Downing Street when Cameron was Prime Minister. He got a sort of there was a civil servant, a very senior civil servant who'd been around the UK government for many years, who'd ended up at Morgan Stanley, and then he'd gone back into government when Cameron was there. And around that time, it was kind of post-financial crisis. The UK government is looking for ways to cut costs. And the report comes out and it says, one way to cut it could be this stuff called supply chain finance. And so this civil servant turns around and he says, well, I know a guy at Morgan Stanley. He was like the guy advocating this thing. So Lex kind of gets his foot in the door because of this, right? So he gets like a sort of very loose role to give a bit of advice to the government on supply chain finance, which he, because he's Lex Greensill, turns into like, an amazing opportunity where he's suddenly got business cards with 10 Downing Street on them. He's holding meetings in 10 Downing Street. He's, inviting kind of former colleagues and business partners in and showing them around as though he owns the place. But, as a result, he sort of gets to know some people. Again, people kind of laugh at him, but, admire his ambition whilst laughing behind his back. He gets to know David Cameron a little bit. And then again, because he's Lex and he understands what kind of motivates people, when Cameron leaves office, he makes an offer to him to come and join Greensill Capital. They kind of have to fudge around it a little bit because of the rules about what politicians in the UK can do after they leave office. But essentially they give him a sort of special advisor role. I mean, ultimately it's like a board level role. Cameron is, what's appealing. So what's appealing to Lex is pretty obvious, right? Massive credibility and Cameron's connections. That is absolutely what Lex wants. And, as the relationship progresses, he's basically badgering Cameron the whole time. You got to call people, you got to do this. And what Cameron gets is pretty obvious too, money, right? So, politicians, they leave office, a lot of them in the UK at least, and I think it's true in Australia too, they go and work for private companies. Typically, I guess they will work for, giant multinationals. UK, former UK prime ministers have gone to work for the likes of JP Morgan. What Cameron was a bit different, right? So there are a couple of theories. One is that his brand was kind of tarnished by Brexit, and so actually the big Wall Street banks weren't that keen to offer him a job. I'm kind of not so sure about that. I've heard people say that, but I kind of think the big Wall Street banks wouldn't care. I think what's more likely, and what I have heard from my sources, is that what was appealing to Cameron about Greensill was a he kind of thought it was cool, right? So Cameron like always wanted to be a bit cooler. So like a fintech startup, that's cooler than going to work for JP Morgan. Two, he didn't think it would be that hard work, right? He'd have to go to a board meeting every now and then, and that would be
It's pretty
okay.
cushy
And
work, to be honest. Sounds like
yeah,
it.
it's pretty cushy work. And the pay was going to be extraordinary. So if they had managed to, if Greensill Capital had IPO'd, I understand he would have been in line to receive tens of millions of pounds, maybe as much as 70 million pounds. Obviously, that never happened. Greensill collapsed before the IPO. Nevertheless, Cameron had a special deal which said that the stock that he was given, the options he was given, I guess, essentially in the company, would vest even before an IPO. And so he was able to extract, I think the BBC said something like £7 million. I think it might have been even more than that. So this was, a lot of money for not a lot of work and pretty quickly. And he gets to be cool. I think what he didn't do was enough due diligence on Lex Greensill. I mean, that's clear. I think as an ex-prime minister, the only thing you've got to sell is your reputation, your credibility. And if you give it to the wrong guy, you kind of really badly burned. I know he was warned by at least a couple of kind of very senior politicians who told him, this guy, don't touch him. And yet Cameron went ahead anyway. Yeah, I mean, I think Cameron has a lot to answer for because I think, his name definitely helped Lex Greensill gain a lot more credibility.
Yeah.
Cameron went with Lex to Japan to secure the investment from SoftBank, which turned this company from being, worth like $1 billion to being worth several $billion. SoftBank Vision Fund put ultimately, well, they put 800 million in, another 600 million in. I think in the end they probably lost a couple of $1 billion. And that was, Cameron went with Lex to secure that.
Wow.
So he's kind of critical to how big Lex becomes.
Absolutely. What's Cameron said about all of this since it's unfolded?
Yeah, I mean, he was pretty quick to distance himself. He did one kind of appearance in front of Parliament when the inquiries initially happened, and since then he's like said nothing, totally refused to engage on it, which I suppose is to be expected, disappointing, but to be expected. Fortunately, a lot of what happened between him and Lex, we know because it was subject to this parliamentary inquiry into a couple of things, the kind of revolving door of politics and business, inquiries into what happened to government loans during the COVID period when Greensill managed to secure quite a lot of UK government money. And so a lot of actually Cameron's role at Greensill Capital is kind of public information now. Text messages and things like that, WhatsApp messages is already public. So, he himself isn't saying much about it. But actually we have a lot already. It's pretty clear what his role was.
Yeah. Is there any, apart from reputational damage, is there any other exposure potentially that could fall on Cameron?
Well, I think the big one is reputational damage. Let's just put it that way.
Right. He doesn't have much left. Poor guy.
I think, look, the other thing my understanding is he flew on the Greensill private jet a lot.
Yeah.
And so that's a pretty big benefit, right? Like, I don't know how you pay tax on a benefit like that. So, there could be stuff like that.
You mentioned before...
But I'm speculating now.
Sure. Don't worry about it. You mentioned before Australian politicians will also go into the private sector. I was intrigued to see Julia Bishop feature in the book. How close was she to getting roped up into all of this?
I mean, really close, right? So she was sort of you know, like, but how much time did she spend with Lex? I don't know, but I think he was perceived as a kind of champion of, it's like something to be proud of, and so she was out, um, promoting Lex Greensill, and was, you know, would have been, again, had the company continued, she would have been a board member. She would have definitely had a role
Wow.
going forward. She kind of was fortunate in some ways that it collapsed before
Yeah.
she had too much exposure.
See, for me, that's particularly intriguing because obviously I don't know Julia Bishop at all on a personal level. I only know broadly what journalists have said about her over the years. But I kind of measure her as all the best qualities of a politician with very few of the worst qualities. The worst qualities being mainly lying, flip-flopping on an issue purely for self-gain and so forth. Julie Bishop did strike me as someone who had like deep integrity to her values and was an
Yeah.
intensely smart individual who really couldn't be taken for a ride. She was the most senior female politician for so many years in the Australian scene. And so for you to say that, yeah, she also fell for the Greensill, silver tongue. I wonder,
Yeah.
what's the lesson in that? Is that just me giving too much
Yeah.
credit to Julia Bishop, or is there something deeper?
I think, look, he tried to charm many people, and lots of them did not fall for it. So I think what it probably tells us is, if you try to charm enough people, some of them will fall for it. And if you're a guy like Greensill, and so she did, and Cameron did, and so did a few other politicians. Not actually politicians of different stripes, right? Like there were politicians from either side of the political spectrum in the UK who were somewhat involved one way or another. I think, it probably teaches us these people all kind of lean on each other a bit, right? So if David Cameron's on board, then maybe Julie Bishop thinks it's okay. If the guy's raised a couple of $1 billion, then people think, oh, it must be somebody else must have done their due diligence.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, leaving the politicians aside for a minute, just thinking about the big investors in Greensill Capital, right? The first really big investor is a private equity fund out of the US called General Atlantic, and they put about $250 million in. They, had sort of tracked Lex for a while. They realized there was some flaws with him, but probably a little bit arrogantly believed that they would be able to fix them. That they were, that was their job as private equity investors. So they put their 250 million in, and then kind of realized pretty quickly afterwards, oh no, we can't fix him. But they're fortunate in that, SoftBank Vision Fund comes along and does like 8 weeks of due diligence before putting $800 million in, partly because they look at General Atlantic and go, well, those guys are really smart and they know what they're doing. So let's just put some money where they are.
Wow.
And that allows General Atlantic to essentially get out, so they're totally all leaning on each other, right?
Yeah.
People are just like, Lex has kind of figured out that if you can get one politician or big investor, then actually you can get more of them because they'll all just kind of, assume the last one did their job properly.
That's so fascinating, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, who knows what supply chain financing is at the level of detail that Lex is selling it on? And yeah, the precautionary principle goes out the window once you see, oh, I respect that person's reputation. If they're on board, I'm on board. What else do I need to see?
There's no way David Cameron really understood the intricacies of supply chain finance. Just no way, right? But once he's in, well, like, the next one kind of thinks they don't even need to think
Yeah.
about that. All they need to know is that David Cameron's in.
Yeah, no, totally. I wonder as well. I mean, I imagine you and your journalistic colleagues could rapture on this for days. But how many existing, similarly, balancing on a knife's edge financial institutions are there out there at the moment, strung up on similar dynamics?
Yeah. I mean, I dread to think, really. Um, you know, I think we're starting to see them get flushed out a little bit, right? Like we went through a period post financial crisis where there was just so much money knocking around. Uh, you know, like if you go to the people at the Vision Fund, right? And they had $100 billion fund. They lost probably a couple of $1 billion on Greensill. Um, I think they're kind of okay with that. You know, I mean, it's like extraordinary to say,
I
but I
know.
think they're kind of like, well, yeah, but we'll make a couple of $1 billion somewhere else, so
Yeah.
that's okay. But I think, that's sort of that time where there was just lots of money around. Clearly, that's coming to an end, right? With interest rates rising around the world and so on. We're in a very different world to where we were maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and so maybe if it would be impossible to pull off a Greensill capital now.
Mm. You've mentioned a few times throughout the chat, just offhandedly, but avoiding tax or creative accounting and so forth. One of the major themes in this podcast has been the cancerous nature of offshore finance and financial secrecy. Nicholas Shaxson, one of the godfathers on this topic, has been a repeated guest, as has a number of other people who have written explicitly on the topic. And although it's not explicitly spoken about throughout the book, I imagine you would have just, especially as a former accountant yourself, just come across case after case of, wow, this is hidden under layers and layers of secrecy. How much,
Mm.
yeah. So underneath all that question is just asking you what role the offshore financial system played in all of this.
Yeah, the offshore structures I think are really important when you start to look at the kind of murkier loans in the green cell world. So just to give you an example that's fairly straightforward, there's one loan that Lex makes to a company called Atlantic 57. It's owned offshore, I think in the British Virgin Islands, through a couple of other structures. Hard to pin down who exactly owns it, but I was able to ultimately find that it was a long-time associate of Lex Greensill's, and the loan is maybe £20 million or thereabouts. It doesn't get paid back when the GAM funds collapse, which is what happens there. And by the way, GAM is like a complete basket case of a company these days. But when the GAM funds collapse, that loan is sitting there, and it needs to be dealt with. A few months later, I was looking at the Credit Suisse funds, which Greensill had kind of started up to replace the pot of money he lost when GAM stopped working with him, and this Atlantic 57 loan suddenly appears in these Credit Suisse funds, which are now kind of Liechtenstein and Luxembourg funds. But I can see them because they disclose enough information I can see it. So then I go to Credit Suisse and I say, hey, this loan that's in here, this has been around for a while now. And by the way, it was in the GAM funds, which collapsed. And, by the way, it's tied to Lex's friend by these offshore entities. And the Credit Suisse guys there kind of plead ignorance. And then the next set of Credit Suisse documents that appear, it's gone. And you don't really know where it goes until Greensill as a whole collapses, and suddenly it appears in the German bank that he owns. So this is like a loan to an offshore entity whose ultimate ownership is unclear, but he can kind of tie it to a friend Alexis, and it starts off in one fund, moves to another fund. They're both offshore. Then it ends up in a German bank. This is like complicated. It's a shell game of shuffling money around. That is a classic kind of offshore mess, really. And actually, right now, that whole sort of weird structure that he set up is causing so many problems, right? As the wind up of Greensill Capital has become really, really complicated because there are so many different entities in so many different jurisdictions that lawyers and the people who think they're owed money are really struggling to figure out, how to get to it.
That is an incredible example. Thank you for giving it. And although it might seem like a redundant question, could you highlight what the problem is with that entire structure that you just laid out?
Yeah, well, the problem with that one in particular is that this loan was sitting at different times in funds that were marketed, like, so these are investment vehicles marketed to um, you know, to some ordinary investors as safe, reliable, low risk loans. And clearly, that is not a safe, reliable, low risk
Right.
loan. In fact, as I said earlier, it's not really a loan at all, right? It never gets repaid. So that's not a loan. That's just a payment to Lex's friend.
Yeah. And so it is very explicitly a cover up to benefit the financiers and not hold anybody
Okay.
accountable at the end of the day.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah. I was going to say, the other thing about something like that, right, is this is 20 million. I think it ends up being like 35 million because the loan, there's a bit more added to the loan every few months when it's not repaid. The thing about something like that is, in this world where he's got like billions of dollars of loans in theory to, Coca-Cola and Nestle and so on, that 35 million is sort of immaterial, right? Except that there are lots of the 35 millions. And
Mm.
actually they're the only amounts on which he's actually recording any profit.
So this might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but since you operate in the world of financial journalism, you're a trained accountant, I would be really, really keen to hear you answer the following. Um, could you red pill the audience on just how pervasive and cancerous the offshore financial network and financial secrecy is on the globe? Not to be too hyperbolic with the question, but I just
Yeah.
want to present it to you as that and hear what you think.
Uh, yeah, it's a tricky one to say, like, to quantify it, I think is difficult, but I think it's clearly deeply problematic.
Mm.
Um, I can tell you again, just to go back to Greensill. Look, another way of looking at Greensill is that he set up a business that kind of sat in a regulatory, like, gray area, like a no man's land, right? So he's got a parent company that was registered in Australia, audited by a pretty small Sydney-based auditor, like very small. Um, he's got a main operating company in the UK, which is audited by a pretty small UK company, despite the fact that it's got billions of dollars of transactions in theory running through it. Um, he is registered with the UK Financial Conduct Authority through a kind of third party registration system, which is usually used for like small family offices. The funds that make the Greensill loan, so like the Credit Suisse funds, are listed in Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, so they're in theory kind of regulated there. The German bank, which sort of he shuffles assets in and out of, are kind of it's kind of regulated there, but it's like not that big a deal in Germany. So he kind of manages to sit this whole thing, in a place where it's not really clear who is really on the hook for regulating Greensill as a whole or auditing Greensill as a whole, and that's because he's able to set this up in this complex global way.
And one of the other benefits might be that he can now sit in Bundaberg and presumably still have access to incredible amounts of money, which no matter what criminal conclusions might fall upon him, they will never have access to, and was never taxed and etc.
Mm. Yeah, well, so this is a really good point, right? So he's uh, a lot of money came out of Greensill, right? Like several hundred million dollars went out. When SoftBank put its money in, not much of that was used to kind of invest in the business. Most of it was used to pay out previous investors. So Lex, his brother, took a lot of money out. So a lot of that money's ended up in the farm, right? Which is what's enabled them to grow the farm to such a big size. Um, they're actually, it's funny you talk about the tax situation, because actually he did, one of the things before it collapsed was he was in a big fight with the Australian tax authorities over an unpaid tax bill. 50 million Aussie, I
Oh
believe
my
was the number, but
god.
I may be wrong on that. Yeah, so he
Generational
he had
wealth.
structured. yeah, so he'd structured this investment. Look, I'm no expert on this bit, but there was a part of the investment, I think of either his or his brother's in Greensill Capital was structured through a trust, and when they kind of cashed out some of the stock, they didn't pay any tax on it because of this trust structure, but the Australian tax authorities subsequently ruled that they should have paid tax on it. So, there's a clear example of of him trying to minimize tax and being accused of doing it wrongly. But yeah, I think, this is not uncommon, right? Like, I think most people who have founded businesses like this will go out of their way to minimize their tax bill. And there are legitimate ways to do that, but there are also ways to do it which seem less legitimate.
Which is at the core of the problem, right? Like Lex does not stand alone in having abused these systems. It's common practice, and therefore,
Yeah.
yeah. Just to return to that question for one moment, this is how Bradley Hope answered it. He was the journalist who broke the story of Joe Low and the $1 billion whale, and just an absolutely phenomenal journalist, in my opinion. He said that the red pill would be as follows, basically. You could be a regular guy and you could be just working at a cafe in London, and completely unknown to you, the owner of that building is 40% owned by some Russian oligarch. And so you're there, irrespective of what your politics are, your morality, but you're generating revenue that ultimately a piece of is going to be paid towards the rent of a building that is owned by someone who, in other circumstances, you might refuse to sort of work for. And that's a really, I think, in my eyes, like a good red pill moment. Like, okay, yeah, that's one, totally true, and really brings it down to the personal level and makes you start to have a little bit more legitimacy to your grievance about income disparities and wealth disparities and tax breaks and so forth. Because you can just sound like a bleeding lefty if you're complaining about it all the time. But once you get into it, it's like, no, it's so unfair. It's absurdly unfair. So that, I thought, stood out to me as a great example from Bradley Hope. So I just wanted to, with that context, see if something could come to mind.
Yeah. First of all, I agree. Bradley's fantastic, former colleague of mine and a brilliant journalist, and has done many good stories. Look, I think let me give you a different thing, like a slightly different thing, right? So, but similar, and I'm getting at like similar level of cynicism about the way the whole global financial system is sort of rigged. Okay, so Credit Suisse had about $10 billion of their clients' money in Greensill funds when it collapsed. The details of why it collapsed are a little bit complicated, but not too complicated. But they were warned by me and others that they'd invest their clients' money in some things they shouldn't have invested in. So why then didn't they pay them out? Like, why didn't they pay their clients back? What's happened there? Well, because if they pay their clients back, then the Swiss financial regulator will say to them, well, look, if you're always going to pay back your clients when you make a loss on their investments, then you're going to have to reserve that much capital against all of your investment funds. And so for Credit Suisse, that's really problematic. So that means they certainly know now that they were ripped off and taken for a ride, but they kind of can't admit it, because if they do, it's gonna cost the bank billions more. Now, Credit Suisse, as it turns out, is gone now anyway. But that was part of why, like, they're reluctant to admit the truth, right? Which is a couple of our portfolio managers didn't do their work properly and got ripped off. And there's another way that the system is kind of rigged, I think, right? That even when these sort of scandals come to light, actually the big financial players don't have that much incentive to like acknowledge it. It's not good for them to say, yeah, we got ripped off.
Since you brought up Credit Suisse, as you noted, they've since been bought by their biggest competitor. for a bargain, 3 billion francs. And the Economist made a direct connection between Credit Suisse collapse and the Greensill affair. So could you explain, in addition to what you just did, $10 billion they had on the hook for in Greensill's demise, how significant was Lex Greensill and his whole grift towards the demise of this really ancient institution and at the core of global finance?
Yeah. Well, I think really, really critical actually. I think it's probably misunderstood how important Greensill in particular was, because what happened at Credit Suisse in the end, there were many, many scandals at Credit Suisse and many kind of strategic issues and problems there with the bank over the years. But the big thing that happened to them in the last 18 months or so was that a bunch of their clients, people who'd invested money in Credit Suisse's had invested money with Credit Suisse, decided to pull their money out. And we're talking like billions of dollars. Not, a lot of money was coming out, not small amounts of money. This is not even like, retail depositors. This is people with serious money pulling it out. And the reason they're pulling it out is because they're frightened that they're not gonna that if something goes wrong, Credit Suisse will lose their money. And what was a big indicator of that was Lex Greensill and Greensill Capital. And when that happened, they didn't stand by their clients. And so I think Greensill Capital plays a huge role in what happens to Credit Suisse in the end.
To kind of tie that back into an earlier speculation I made about Lex's moral compass and the fact that Bundaberg might still welcome with open arms as like a bit of a, someone who really made something of himself within the community. That on your resume alone, was absolutely fundamental in the destruction of a giant global institution in a non-ethical worldview is quite an achievement in itself. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally agree. Like it's unbelievable, right? Like that this guy, grew up on a farm in Bundaberg, sort of blagged his way in finance, and then plays a major part in the destruction of a global, one of the biggest banks in the world, one of the biggest banks in the world. It's incredible, right? And when you sort of add it all up, the Greensill story it's like fascinating, right? Like prime ministers' reputations are damaged forever. Politicians, more than a handful of politicians get in real trouble. Hundreds of millions of dollars are missing. Billions of dollars are missing still. Investors like SoftBank lose billions of dollars. Credit Suisse goes bust. GAM is, struggling to survive and is kind of being passed from one potential buyer to another. It's pretty amazing that this happened, and I think it's sort of I think it got lost a little bit in the UK as a scandal because it became such a political scandal. The financial element of it got forgotten about a little bit. It became about lobbying, former Prime Minister lobbying on behalf of the company he worked for. But what got lost a little bit in that was that it wouldn't have mattered if he was lobbying for a company he worked for that was a legitimate company out to do good business. What matters is that he's lobbying for a company that is accused of being a Ponzi scheme and which is, implicated in all of these major disruptions in the financial markets.
I think that was a terrific summary. So let's wrap it up there. I got a couple more questions for you, not necessarily Greensill related, but they try to ask them to as many guests as possible. You still got a bit of time?
Sure.
Brilliant. I lie. One more on the Greensill affair. Who, at the end of the day, were the victims of all of this grift?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I think it gets lost and forgotten a little bit. But there are investors in the Credit Suisse funds who lost money. So there are, some of those are big institutions, but there are individuals. And sure, they're relatively wealthy individuals, but nevertheless, they lost millions of dollars. There were 1,000 employees at Greensill Capital, most of whom thought they were working for a legitimate, fast-growing business, and they're all out of work. There were along the way a couple of whistleblowers who whose careers were ruined, whose kind of lives were shattered because they, had the nerve to speak up and say there's something wrong here. So I think there are a lot of victims of Greensill, and then of course, if you look at the sort of value destruction, whether it's at the SoftBank Vision Fund or anywhere else, like these are often it's like pension money, right? Pension fund money and so on. So the money came from somewhere. The money that got lost came from somewhere, and at the end of the day, it's kind of you know the victims might not be easy to spot, but they are there.
And with that being said, with the assumption that Lex is monitoring everything Duncan Mavin, and that there is a very real possibility he listens to this conversation, is there something you would want to say directly to Lex?
Oh, that's a really good question. Look, I have talked to Lex in the past. Before it all blew up, I talked to him several times. And I've tried to talk to him since. He is much less friendly now than he was before. Um, I think it's really tough to say how we would talk right now. There's so much going on for him uh, in different lawsuits and investigations and so on. I prefer to find out what happens as a result of all of those sort of dynamics, and then maybe ask him a couple of questions based on the outcome.
Okay, nice. So no direct
You
down the
know
barrel
what?
of the
There is one
camera.
direct question. There is one direct question I suppose I could ask. Um, there's an anecdote in the book about my car being broken into, and pretty sure it was a corporate espionage type thing. Um, and so I'd just like to ask him if I could have my sweaty gym bag back, please.
Nice. That's framed as a memento in his rumpus room.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. Well, incredible, Duncan. Thank you so much again for all of that. Um, really, there's only three questions that I try to ask every guest. And so, damn it, I keep setting this up the wrong way. Um, a really fascinating detail from all of this, not related to Lex, but is that this all started for you from a tip from a long-term source of yours. And so I wanted to ask about when you are talking, with your mates, fellow journalists, how often are big stories incepted by an anonymous tip versus first-hand journalists digging where they uncover it themselves?
Um, that is a good question. I think the best stories usually come from a tip. And that's because, as journalists, uh, we are very reliant on the quality of the information we can get hold of. And people who are already inside a business or know a business inside out or know about a scandal in detail obviously have better information than we do. Occasionally I think a journalist will kind of, dig through some accounts and find a number that doesn't make sense. But it's rare, I think, even then, that they've done that without somebody pointing them in the right direction.
And now that you've published a book that explicitly speaks to a case of financial fraud, alleged financial fraud, do you suspect your tip line to increase?
Yeah, it already has.
That's
It already
that
has.
must be
Yeah,
so rewarding.
it is. It is. The challenge, right, is that people come to you with uh, what they perceive to be like genuinely interesting tips and stories. And in many cases, they are, right? They're really interesting things. Sometimes it's difficult to figure out how do you turn this into a story. Um, Sometimes it's just difficult to verify it, right? So you might get a little bit of information from one person, but how do you verify it from numerous different angles? How do you make sure that it's not somebody who genuinely thinks that they've got, something real to tell, but maybe doesn't understand some other bits of the story. And sometimes it's just a matter of time, right? Like you just don't have the time. You're dealing with lots of other things. Um, I mean, look, when I've come across interesting things lately, I've tried to keep them, I've tried to be really upfront with people, say to them, look, I'm interested in what you're saying. I'm not sure I can make it a story, but if you want to keep talking to me, if you want to keep helping me try to figure out how we make it into a story, I'm interested in doing that. But I can't promise anything, right? And I think that's the only fair way you can be with sources, right? And then you have to be, you got to exercise due skepticism about their motivations and the motivations of everybody else that you might talk to.
And finally, do you think that we live in an age of unprecedented financial fraud?
I think we live in an age when there is an incredible amount of money around, where possibly, the financial system is so complicated and so globalized that there are places where, bad actors can seek to make money in bad ways. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think I guess for that reason, just the scale of the money, scale of the global economy. I think you're right. We do. But are people worse now than they were 100 years ago? I don't know if that's true. Charles Ponzi, the uh, name behind the Ponzi scheme, that's 100 years ago. So people have been doing bad stuff for a long time.
I'm going to publish an episode in a few weeks with a guy called Matthew Friedman, who runs the Mekong Society. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Yeah,
No, you have.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'm sure you're familiar with the absolute horror that is at the core of his job. And if you take his worldview, um, yeah, it's worse than it's ever been. Obviously you covered a big global fraud case of fraud, but more um, individual cases of financial fraud. It's worse than it's ever
Mm.
been, and more accessible to more bad actors than it's ever been. And
Yeah,
one of the worst parts is that the exact same financial hidden, the exact same forces of lack of financial transparency and offshore networks enable the scale of these organizations just as much as they enable the scale of Greensill Capital.
yeah, I think that's right. I think that just the sort of scale of the global economy, the the speed with which transactions happen, um, I think that it's likely that there is more happening now than there has been. Um, in absolute terms, I don't know if it's true in kind of proportionate terms, right? Um, there's some pretty bad financial stuff happen historically.
All right, Duncan, three that I try to ask everybody. First of all, what is the role that serendipity has played in your life?
Oh, I mean, huge. I think. Look, I studied history at university. I became an accountant. I kind of traveled the world with my accounting. I became a journalist, traveled the world with my journalism. Those things have all happened through kind of serendipitous kind of happenings. Um, this particular, like writing this book, is probably the most serendipitous of all of them. Um, as we talked about, like a long-time source, somebody who I think I, had earned the trust of, set me on the path to writing about this thing. And it's been a major part of my life, actually.
Incredible. And in your personal life, anything worth commenting on?
Uh, oh, I don't know. I'm like, now I'm really on the spot. Uh, no, I look, I mean, I kind of am really interested in getting to the truth of things. I have a pretty strong sense of kind of right and wrong, I guess, and that is always that sort of drives me a bit.
Hmm. If you could What is a country that you're particularly bullish on?
That's a difficult one. I'm really interested in India. Um, I just think that, India's role in the world is going to be huge over the next however many decades. I think it's just going to be so important, how the West relates to India in particular. And so I'm a bullish, I don't know, but I'm really interested to see how India sort of evolves. Um, Clearly, it's going to be really important in every aspect of kind of um, whether we're talking about climate change or whether we're talking about economics or geopolitics. I think India is really, really important.
And are you optimistic about the role they'll play?
I'm not sure. At the minute, I don't feel very optimistic about, many places. Um, it's difficult, I think, to find anywhere to feel really bullish on.
Yeah. Not the great state of Queensland and the city of Bundaberg. They just had a bunch of capital flight fled into the city.
Well, I think I heard there's some really big things happening in sweet potatoes there.
All right. And finally, Duncan, if you could witness a conversation between any two people of history, dead or alive, no language barrier. So if you were to listen to a podcast, who are the two people you would want to be listening to?
Okay, so I'm a history graduate. Um, Really, really kind of it's a tough choice for me. But I'm really interested in uh, the Battle of Trafalgar, and so Horatio Nelson, I would, before he's shot, before he's finally dying, I think would be just a fascinating character, especially because he's kind of such a like a gung ho kind of guy.
Hmm.
Um, and my other real sort of passion, I suppose, is football. So if I could put together like Horatio Nelson and Pele and hear them talk about the best tactics to win, that would probably be a pretty interesting one.
I love it. Super eclectic. Thank you so much, Duncan. Yeah, and thank you for the book. It was such a good read. I loved it.
Great. Thanks, Ryan.